The sun cast a golden shimmer over the calm lake, reflecting the serenity of the morning. The exclusive lakeshore community was still waking up, the sound of birds filling the air. Everything was peaceful. Until chaos broke loose. A tow truck rumbled onto the dock, its massive chains clanking as a group of men in HOA uniforms moved toward a sleek, expensive black yacht moored at the waterfront. Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, stood at the edge of the dock, her arms crossed, a smirk creeping onto her lips. "This is an unauthorized vessel," she declared, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Take it out of here, now!" The HOA workers obeyed instantly, throwing thick ropes around the boat, tightening the grips as they prepared to drag it away. Karen watched with satisfaction. She loved moments like these, reminding people who was in charge, reminding them that in her neighborhood, her rules were the law. The owner of this boat had refused to pay the HOA's ridiculous dock maintenance fees, so this was her way of teaching them a lesson. "Let's move," one of her men called, starting the winch. The chains tightened. The boat lurched as it was pulled from the dock. Karen folded her arms, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. Another victory. But she didn't know. She had just made a grave mistake. Inside the boat, deep in the cabin, Idris Elba sat in complete silence. Eyes closed, steady breaths. His mind was clear, his body at ease. He had spent the early morning meditating, enjoying the quiet escape this place provided, the gentle rocking of the water, the distant sounds of nature. It was exactly what he needed, until something shifted, a sudden jolt, a rough pull. His senses snapped to attention. His sharp mind, honed by years of experience, processed everything in an instant. Something was wrong. He opened his eyes. The peaceful stillness was gone. The boat was moving, but not by his command. Idris's jaw tightened. Calmly, he stood up. Meanwhile, Karen turned to her assistant, chuckling. "This is why you don't mess with me," she gloated. "People think they can just ignore the rules, but I always—" Her words were cut off by a sound behind her. A creak. The boat door swung open. And then, he stepped out. Idris Elba. Tall, broad-shouldered, a presence that demanded attention. He stood at the edge of the yacht, his sharp eyes scanning the scene, assessing the situation. Unshaken, unbothered. The air shifted. The workers froze. The laughter and celebration died instantly. Karen's smirk vanished. Idris locked eyes with her, cold, intense, unforgiving. Then in a voice low and steady, a warning. "You just made a big mistake." The silence that followed Idris. Elba's words was thick. The air had changed. Karen Whitmore's smug expression flickered, just for a second. But she recovered quickly, forcing an arrogant chuckle as she looked him up and down. "Oh, great," she sneered. "Another one." Idris didn't move, didn't blink. His piercing gaze cut through her like a knife. The HOA workers stood awkwardly, uncertain. Nobody had expected this. Nobody had expected him. Karen, however, wasn't one to back down. She placed a hand on her hip, tilting her chin up. "You must be confused, Mr. Elba. This boat is illegally docked, and in this community, we follow the rules." Idris let the words settle. Then he took a slow, measured step forward. "Whose rules?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Karen smirked. "My rules." Her tone was dripping with entitlement, with power. She had spent years shaping this community into her vision. A vision where she controlled everything and everyone. She turned, addressing the gathered crowd. Neighbors who had stopped to watch, some whispering among themselves. "This is Lakeshore Community, a place of order, of standards, and we don't tolerate disturbances." "Like black homeowners?" Idris cut in. His voice was still calm, but his words hit like a bullet. A hush fell over the crowd. Karen's smirk tightened, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she laughed. "Oh, don't start with that nonsense," she waved a hand dismissively. "Rules are rules. If you can't follow them, you don't belong here." Idris tilted his head, studying her. He had seen people like her before, power-hungry, racist, dangerous, people who hid behind rules and policies to enforce their own twisted version of control. And he could already tell Karen wasn't just a neighborhood bully. She was worse. Idris hadn't come to Lakeshore for trouble. He had come to visit an old friend, Malcolm Hayes, a retired Navy veteran, the kind of man who had spent his life serving his country and had asked for little in return. Malcolm had bought this lakeside home years ago, thinking he'd found the perfect retirement spot. But instead of peace, he had found a war, one against an HOA that seemed determined to push him out. They started small, unfair fines, sudden violations, petty complaints. Then it escalated. They tried to revoke his property rights over technicalities. They spread rumors. They harassed him with constant inspections. And leading the charge? Karen Whitmore. She had made it her personal mission to remove Malcolm from the community, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he didn't fit her vision of what this neighborhood should look like. Still, Malcolm fought back. He had spent the last year exposing the corruption behind the HOA, the money laundering, the fraudulent fines, the way they forced out Black and minority homeowners under the guise of maintaining property values. But every time he got close to proving something, the HOA shut him down. Threats, retaliation, false charges. They wanted him gone. And now, this stunt with the boat? This wasn't about unauthorized docking. This was about power, about Karen flexing her control, about breaking Malcolm once and for all. Karen Whitmore leaned in closer, lowering her voice so only Idris could hear. "You think being famous means you get to make the rules here?" she whispered, her eyes cold. "This is my community." Idris didn't respond immediately. He let her words linger, watching the way she thrived on control. Then, he smirked. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker. "You must think you're untouchable," he said. Karen's smirk grew. "I don't think. I know." Idris nodded slowly. Then his voice dropped, his tone deadly. "We'll see about that." "You must think you're untouchable," he said. Karen's smirk grew. "I don't think. I know." Idris nodded slowly. Then his voice dropped, his tone deadly. "We'll see about that." Karen Whitmore wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a criminal. For years, she had been running an illegal extortion racket, using HOA policies as a weapon. Homeowners were forced to pay massive fines for fabricated violations. Those who couldn't pay faced threats, vandalism, and even property seizures. Anyone who spoke out, they mysteriously disappeared or were buried under mountains of debt until they were forced to leave. And her enforcers? Not just ordinary security guards, ex-cops, dirty ones. Men who had been kicked off the force for brutality, corruption, or worse. They weren't just there to enforce HOA rules. They were Karen's private army. Late that night, Idris sat across from Malcolm in his small lakeside home. The air was tense. "This isn't just about you," Idris said. "She's got an entire system backing her up." Malcolm took a sip of his whiskey, staring into the glass. "I know." His voice was calm, but his eyes held years of exhaustion. "But if we don't stop her, who will?" Idris leaned forward. "This isn't a fair fight, Malcolm. You're playing by the rules. She isn't." Malcolm smiled, shaking his head. "You think I don't know that? I fought in 2 wars, Idris. I've faced men worse than Karen Whitmore. The difference is, I'm not scared of her." Idris exhaled, leaning back. He respected Malcolm. But this fight, it was about to get deadly. The first attack came the next morning. Malcolm stepped outside to find his boat vandalized, spray-painted with racial slurs, the windows smashed in, the engine sabotaged. The second attack came that night. A brick through his window, barely missing his head. A note attached. "Leave or else." But the third attack, that was the real warning. 2 masked men broke into Malcolm's home, destroying everything in their path. He fought back, hard, but he was outnumbered. They left him bruised, bloody, a warning burned into his front lawn. "This is your final chance." Idris arrived minutes later, helping Malcolm to his feet. "This isn't just intimidation," Idris muttered. "This is war." Idris knew they were being watched, followed. That night, as he walked through the dimly lit streets, he spotted a man tailing him, one of Karen's enforcers. Big, heavy-set, trained, Idris led him into an alley. The moment the enforcer turned the corner, Idris struck. A brutal elbow to the face. Crack! The man stumbled back, blood spilling from his nose. He swung wildly. Idris ducked, countered, drove a fist into his ribs. The enforcer gasped for air, but Idris wasn't done. A sharp kick to the knee sent the man crashing down. Then, Idris grabbed him by the collar. "You work for Karen Whitmore?" Idris growled. The man coughed, spitting blood. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he sneered. Idris tightened his grip. "Then tell me." The enforcer just laughed. "She's more powerful than you think." Idris didn't blink. He pulled the man closer. "Good. So am I." And with that, he slammed the enforcer against the wall, knocking him out cold. As Idris walked away, one thing was clear. This fight was just getting started. Idris wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. He spent the next few days digging deeper, making calls, following the money. And what he found? Karen Whitmore wasn't the real enemy. She was just a pawn. The true mastermind was a name that sent chills down Idris's spine. Victor Langley. A billionaire real estate mogul. Ruthless, untouchable. And worst of all, he had been doing this for years. Langley's plan was simple, but brutal. Use the HOA to terrorize black homeowners. Force them into selling their properties for nothing. Then flip the land for millions, turning the community into an exclusive, all-white luxury resort. Karen was just his attack dog, the public face to keep his name out of the spotlight. But now, Idris had uncovered the truth. And that meant Langley had a new problem. Idris sat across from Malcolm in his dimly lit living room. The smell of burnt wood still lingered from the last attack. "This isn't just HOA corruption," Idris said, his voice low. "This is a full-scale conspiracy." Malcolm exhaled, gripping his whiskey glass. "So Karen's not the boss?" Idris shook his head. "No, Victor Langley is, and he's been doing this to black communities for years." Malcolm slammed his glass down. "That son of a—" "Yeah." Idris leaned forward. "He's not just after you. He's after everyone." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Then we bring him down." Idris knew that was coming. "Malcolm, this guy is dangerous. You saw what they did to you already." But Malcolm's eyes burned with defiance. "If we back down now, they win." Idris sighed, rubbing his hands together. He respected Malcolm, but this wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a war. That night, Langley struck back. Malcolm had just gone to bed when he smelled it. Smoke. At first, he thought it was a dream. Then he heard the shattering glass, the roar of flames licking the walls. He threw himself out of bed, coughing, eyes burning. His front door was already engulfed in fire. They weren't just trying to scare him this time. They wanted him dead. Malcolm fought his way to the back door, but it was jammed. Then, bang! The windows exploded, the heat searing his skin. He barely made it out, stumbling into the street, covered in burns and soot. Idris arrived just in time to see Malcolm collapse onto the pavement. Malcolm lay in a hospital bed, bandaged, barely conscious. Idris stood over him, fists clenched. He had seen enough. Karen, Langley, the whole corrupt system. They had no idea who they were messing with. Idris leaned in close to Malcolm and whispered, "They started this." His eyes burned with fury. "Now I finish it." Langley and Karen had built their empire on fear and secrecy. Idris was about to tear that apart. Using his military contacts and cyber experts, he gathered evidence, bank transactions, blackmail emails, real estate fraud files. Then he did something they never expected. He leaked it all online. The fake HOA fines targeting black homeowners. The backroom deals where Langley forced families out. The recorded threats from Karen's enforcers. Within hours, the internet exploded. News stations picked it up. Langley's name was everywhere. And that's when everything got deadly. Langley wasn't just angry. He was furious. Karen sat in his high-rise office, her hands shaking. "We're finished," she stammered. "The media, everyone." Langley's face was ice cold. "No, we're not." He turned to his assistant. "Get it done." Karen's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Langley didn't look at her. "Idris Elba dies tonight." Idris felt it before he saw it. A black SUV had been following him for the last 3 miles. Then, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Run!" That's when the first gunshot shattered his window. Idris slammed the gas, his car roaring down the highway. Bullets tore through the back windshield. He swerved hard, narrowly dodging a truck. But the SUV wasn't alone. 3 more cars appeared in his rear view. This wasn't just an attack. It was an execution. Idris wasn't unarmed. A name click. He pulled out his Glock 17, took a deep breath, then swung the wheel. His car spun in a violent 180-degree turn. Before they could react, he fired. One bullet shattered a driver's windshield. Another hit the SUV's tires, sending it skidding into a barricade. The last shot took down a gunman before he could aim. But the fight wasn't over. A masked assassin jumped out of the wreckage, charging straight at Idris. The hitman swung first. A brutal punch aimed for Idris's throat. Idris dodged, then countered with an elbow strike to the ribs. The assassin stumbled, but recovered fast, pulling a knife. Idris smirked. Bad choice. The next few seconds were a blur. Bone-crunching strikes, blocks, counters. Idris caught the assassin's wrist, twisted hard, then snapped it. The knife clattered to the ground. One final punch, and the hitman dropped like a stone. Idris didn't waste time. He hunted Karen down, finding her holed up in her mansion, shaking with fear. She knew she had lost. You have no idea what's coming," she stammered. Idris stepped closer. His voice was like steel. "I do." Karen swallowed hard. Langley had already thrown her under the bus. And now so had Idris. He leaned in, his voice a whisper. "Run, before I find you." Karen knew she was finished. Langley had used her, then abandoned her when things got too messy. Desperate, she made a call. To the FBI. "I have proof," she whispered. "Everything you need on Victor Langley." But before she could finish, her front door exploded. A single bullet silenced her forever. Langley never left loose ends. Idris knew Langley was waiting for him. The billionaire's private estate was a fortress, guarded by ex-military mercenaries, snipers, and surveillance. But Idris didn't care. This wasn't a war anymore. This was a reckoning. 1 a.m. The power cut out. Security cameras went dark. Guards fumbled with their radios, static. Then silence. Until crack. A guard collapsed, throat crushed before he could scream. Idris moved like a shadow. Silenced shots. Bone-breaking strikes. Perfectly timed takedowns. One by one, Langley's elite guard fell. But the real fight was just beginning. The last group of guards didn't go down easy. They came fast, brutal, and armed to the teeth. Idris responded with sheer precision. A knife block, followed by a wrist snap. A gun grab, then 3 perfect headshots. An arm lock, twist, disarm, then a knee to the face. Blood splattered. Bodies dropped. And then only one man was left, Victor Langley. Langley stood in his lavish office sipping whiskey like he hadn't just ordered a dozen murders. When Idris walked in, Langley didn't even flinch. Instead, he smirked. "Name your price." Idris didn't respond. Langley leaned forward. Calm, cold, untouched. "You think you're a hero? You're not. You're a man who still needs to eat, Still needs a life. I can make all of this go away. He tossed a black duffel bag onto the table. Millions in cash. Walk away. Idris stared at the money. Then he moved. Fast. Langley didn't even see the first punch coming. Crack! His nose shattered. Langley stumbled back, screaming in pain. Idris grabbed him by the collar, slamming him into the desk. This was never about money. Punch. This is about every family you destroyed. Punch. This is about every person you ruined. Langley coughed, blood splattering on his expensive suit. Please, he choked. I can fix this. Idris raised his fist one last time. Then he stopped. Because killing Langley? That would be easy. Destroying everything he built? That would be justice. Idris pulled out a USB drive. One click, and Langley's empire collapsed. The files uploaded to every major news outlet. Corruption, fraud, bribery, extortion. Langley's entire world burned. Outside, sirens wailed. The FBI stormed in. Langley collapsed to his knees. Defeated. Finished. As they dragged him away, Idris leaned in one last time. You thought money made you untouchable. He smirked. Look at you now. Langley was done. The FBI had him in cuffs, his billion-dollar empire collapsing overnight. News reports ran non-stop. Corrupt billionaire exposed. HOA scandal unravels a nationwide conspiracy. His assets were seized. His partners turned on him. His political allies denied knowing him. Victor Langley, once untouchable, was now just another criminal behind bars. But for Idris, the fight wasn't over. In the hospital, Malcolm lay weak but alive. His face was covered in bruises, his arm wrapped in bandages. But his eyes, they still had fire. When Idris walked in, Malcolm smirked. Didn't think I'd go down that easy, did you? Idris chuckled. Tough old bastard. Malcolm sighed. They got what they deserved? Idris nodded. Langley's finished. Karen's gone. The HOA? Dismantled. Every last corrupt official is being investigated. Malcolm exhaled, his body relaxing for the first time in months. You did good, brother. A long pause. Then Malcolm's smile faded. But this isn't over, is it? Idris didn't answer. Because they both knew the truth. This wasn't just a corrupt HOA. This wasn't just about Langley. There was something bigger. Idris stood by the lake, watching the sun set over Malcolm's newly repaired boat. The waters were calm, too calm. The fight was over. Or so it seemed. Then a black SUV pulled up behind him. Idris didn't turn around. Didn't need to. He knew this wasn't just a casual visit. A man in a suit stepped out, tall, clean-cut, government type. He walked up beside Idris, handing him a thick file. Idris finally spoke. FBI? The man smirked. Something bigger. Idris opened the file. His eyes narrowed. Inside, names, faces, locations. Corrupt elites, high-level politicians, shady corporations. Langley was nothing compared to this. The man in the suit crossed his arms. This wasn't just one HOA. This was a test run. They're doing this across the country. Idris kept flipping through the pages. Every name, every connection. This was deep. A long pause. Then Idris smirked. He closed the file, went and turned to the man. Then let's finish what we started. Fade to black.